Hi, I'm Gary. Welcome back to my channel, Gary Does Solar. In my last video we looked at the effect that shading would have on your solar panels, both with and without optimizers and microinverters. I received a lot of great feedback in the comments and some requests for additional areas to cover. There's certainly a lot more to shading than meets the eye, so I thought I'd create this follow-up video. Let's dive in. As this video builds on the content of my previous video, I thoroughly recommend you watch that first. The link is in the video description. In that video we looked at how solar panels are able to counteract the effects of partial shading all by themselves without the need for any optimizers or microinverters. Here's a quick recap of how that works. The solar panel we used as an example throughout the video contained 60 solar cells arranged in 3 substrings of 20 cells. Each of those substrings being managed by a single bypass diode. Assuming each cell is 0.5 volts, this gives a total of 30 volts across the whole panel. And if the current flowing through the panels is 10 amps at peak generation, this provides 300 watts of power. If we introduce some partial shading onto the panel, this will cause the current in the affected substring to reduce. And if the reduction is greater than around 20%, the bypass diode for that substring will kick in, rerouting all 10 amps of current around the substring, essentially preserving it for the remaining substrings in this panel and all the other panels in the array. We lose 10 volts worth of cells as a consequence, which in turn reduces the power output to 200 watts. But if there were no bypass diodes in place, the power output of the whole array would reduce dramatically. Technology is always improving, and there has been an evolution to this type of panel over the last few years. Let's take a look at it. Solar cells today typically range from 15 to 21 centimeters square. It was recently discovered that if cells were cut in half, the amount of current flowing through each half cell would reduce by 50%. And the lower the current, the less power loss there would be in the panel itself, and also the less damage potential in the event of any cell hotspots. This gave rise to the half-cell panel, which as you can see has a slightly different external appearance. Looking inside this panel, we can see that the half cells are arranged in 6 substrings. 3 of those substrings are in the upper half of the panel and the other 3 in the lower half. Like the standard panel, there are 3 bypass diodes managing all of the substrings, but these are located in the middle of the panel rather than the top. Let's look at how current traverses through the panel then. Let's say we have 10 amps coming into the panel. This immediately splits into 5 amps travelling upwards into the first substring and 5 amps travelling downwards into another substring. These currents combine again after the first bypass diode, and the current splitting repeats for the next 2 and the final 2 substrings. We compute the total power output then as follows. Each half cell operates at 0.5 volts. The voltage is the same as it would be for a full cell, but now only has 5 amps flowing through it. So that's a generation of 2.5 watts per half cell. Each substring contains 20 half cells, so that gives us 50 watts generation per substring. As we have 6 substrings, that's a total generation of 300 watts for the panel, the same as we had for the standard panel. So why do half cells lead to an improvement in terms of partial shading over a standard panel then? Let's introduce the same kind of shading as we did before to find out. This level of shading only affects one of the substrings, so you might be thinking we'll only lose the 50 watts of power that substring was generating. But actually that's not true. If the first bypass diode kicks in, it reroutes all 10 amps of current away from the top substring as well. This means the total power reduces to 200 watts, exactly the same as what would happen in a standard panel. Okay, that doesn't sound good. What if we increase the area of partial shading so that it covers 2 of the lower substrings? Well, this is enough to cause the second bypass diode to kick in, and you guessed it, the 10 amps of current is rerouted away from the middle 2 substrings completely, resulting in a total power output of 100 watts. Again, the same as for the standard panel. By now you're probably thinking you've wasted your money on buying these half-cell panels, but here's where the magic comes in, and it's all about strategically limiting the current coming into the panel in the first place. In order to understand this better, we need to get a bit heavy for a moment and look at the IV curve for the panel. You may remember this type of graph from my previous video, where the voltage is plotted against the current. The inverter is able to adjust the current coming into the panel in an effort to achieve the highest power output. As power is voltage multiplied by current, it is essentially looking for the largest area under the IV curve. For a standard full cell panel, this occurs at this point, where the power output is 100 watts. Now, if we plot the IV curve for the half cell panel, things get rather interesting. The curve is a little more complex. Looking at it closely, it's telling us that a reduction to the current to 5 amps leads to a second inflection point on the right. And if we analyse the area under the curve at that point, it shows a much higher power output of 150 watts. We can see this better if we superimpose the PV or power voltage curve on top. The inverter will essentially perform a sweep across the curve to determine the highest power output. On older inverters, this was achieved using a very basic algorithm, identifying and selecting the first peak it came across. But newer inverters are able to perform what is called a global sweep, identifying all the local peaks and then selecting the highest one. If we go back to our panel then and limit the current entering it to 5 amps, you can see that something different happens. The first and second bypass diodes no longer kick in. This is because the 5 amps is easily able to travel through the first and second substrings. Then, on the right, the current splits down to 2.5 amps for each of the 2 substrings there, before combining again at the output. So we have 50 watts from substring 1, 50 watts from substring 2, 25 watts from substring 3, and 25 watts from substring 6. This totals 150 watts, which is a 50% increase on before. If we go one step further and increase the shading so that it is now right across the bottom, all 5 amps of the current is easily able to pass through the third substring. So half cell panels are even better at managing partial shading than standard full cell panels. And we can see this in action. I found a great video on YouTube which shows how a half cell panel performs against a full cell panel. Here, the guy set up 2 solar panels as a test. The panel on the left is a half cell panel from Trina Solar, and the solar generation from this panel is powering a water fountain on the left. The panel on the right is an equivalent full cell panel also from Trina Solar, and the solar generation from that second panel is powering the water fountain on the right. As you can see, with no shade on either panel, the height of the fountains are the same. The guys now shade the very bottom of both panels. Because this shading is hard shading, as you would expect, all 3 bypass diodes kick in on the full cell panel, reducing the power output to 0, and this stops the fountain. But as we can see, the fountain on the left continues operating at half power. This is just as expected because the inverter will cause the current in the panel to be lowered to avoid any of the bypass diodes kicking in. Now the guys try a different kind of shading, this time a diagonal shading near the top of both panels. You can see that the half cell panel performs slightly better than the full cell panel. Even with hard shading on 2 of the 6 substrings of the half cell panel, it is still operating at half power, which again is in line with what we would expect. With the full cell panel, the fountain height has reduced to 1/3 of what it was, and we know why this is. Hard shading on 2 of the 3 substrings in that panel will have caused 2 of the 3 bypass diodes to kick in. Finally, the guys adjust the diagonal shading so that it covers the full width of both panels. Just like before, hard shading on all 3 substrings of the full cell panel will have caused all 3 bypass diodes to kick in, reducing the power to 0. But for the half cell panel, it can still maintain half power by avoiding any of the bypass diodes kicking in. If you want to understand more about how shading affects power output of half cell panels, you might be interested in this paper I found on the internet. It was written by the R&D team at EDF a few years ago and looks at a variety of shading scenarios and the resulting IV and PV curves. Thanks for sticking with me so far. I know we got pretty heavy there, but hopefully it all makes sense, and all this is helping adding to your understanding of shading. If you can, please hit like on this video so that YouTube will recommend it to others. And if you subscribe to my channel, you'll be the first to see a whole range of new videos that I'm working on. Thank you. Okay, half cell panels are looking pretty good in how they handle shading, but there's a new kid on the block. The next evolution in solar panel technology is shingled panels. It's not actually a new technology, having been invented more than 10 years ago, but it's a technology that's finally getting traction in the market, If we look at a full cell panel, there are gaps between the solar cells which contain the bus bars. These transfer the current from one cell to the next in line. In a half cell panel, there are almost twice as many bus bars. The more bus bars on the panel, the less usable area there is to capture sunlight, and the greater the chance of failure of any of the connections. Before you panic, I should stress that the chance of failure in these connections is incredibly low, which is why we see panel warranties of 25 years or even up to 40 years in some cases. Shingled panels are made by taking a standard full solar cell and laser cutting it into 5 strips. These strips are then reattached to each other, but this time with a slight overlap. This method allows for a complete solar strip to be made of any length without the need of any bus bars. These solar strips can then be arranged in a variety of configurations within the solar panel. In our example here, the panel comprises 10 strips, one on top of the other. Current comes into the panel and travels across the first 5 strips in parallel. It then travels across the 5 remaining strips in parallel before exiting the panel. You can see that when shading is introduced, the inverter will have a variety of options open to it in order to preserve the power output of the panel. This diagram shows how shingled panels in blue perform even better than half-cell panels in orange for both horizontal and vertical shading. Shingled panels are a great step forward in shading management, as well as providing many other benefits. For example, because they require less area to provide the same power output, they're ideal for my own solar installation. You see, my roof has a number of Velux windows, and no matter what traditional panels I tried, I just couldn't get the array size I wanted without breaching the roof margin requirement of the UK MCS scheme. Thankfully, my installer determined that Delta shingled panels from Perlite solved the problem for me nicely. Okay, let's turn our attention to optimizers and microinverters. In my last video, you could be forgiven for coming away from that thinking that optimizers and microinverters were simply not worth the money. I certainly received quite a few comments to that effect, so in this follow-up video I tried my best to find as many positives as I could, and I won't lie, I really struggled. I tried to find any kind of evidence that I could to show that for shading, optimizers and microinverters had significant discernible value against cost. Here's what I found then, the good and the bad, starting with multiple roof orientations. Here's a typical house with east and west facing roofs. Let's stick some panels on. Now the simplest setup would be something like this, with all the panels wired in series to a string inverter. There's a problem with this setup, however, because as the sun rises, the east facing panels will be generating far more power than the west facing panels. Even if there is only a 20% difference between the two, the bypass diodes on the west facing panels will kick in, reducing the overall power output. The good news is that today nearly all string inverters support 2 strings, so we can split the array into east and west strings like so. But what if we wanted to put a couple of panels on a south-facing roof too? How would we wire them? Well, we could extend string 1 to include the 2 new panels, but this would lead to the same problems as before. The inverter only supports 2 strings, and although some inverters can support 3 strings, they are more expensive. Another way is to keep the current inverter and use optimizers on all the panels in string 1, like so. These optimizers should easily be able to manage the differences in generation between the east-facing and south-facing panels. In fact, it's one of their biggest selling points. Each optimizer performs its own maximum power point tracking for the panel it is managing. So if there are differences in generation across the panels, the optimizers are able to work around that in order to retain the highest possible power output. Now, if you have a roof configuration similar to this one, and you're thinking about using Tigo optimizers for that purpose, you may want to check out this blog post from Mark Kavanagh. Mark runs a solar installation business called MC Electrical out of Brisbane, Australia. MC Electrical has installed hundreds of solar installations using all kinds of string inverters, microinverters and optimizers. So when Mark has something to say about performance and reliability, I'm listening. Here he raises some concerns about Tigo optimizers, and it's well worth your time reading it. Additionally, one of my viewers, Peter Strauss, had his own concerns about Tigo optimizers not living up to their promise. Peter happens to have a strong background in complex radar, so he put his deductive and abductive reasoning skills to good use in coming up with this report, and I've shared that with you in the video description. What is interesting is that Peter's findings match those of Mark's in his blog. Now, it's not my aim to rate particular manufacturers' products, but if people have taken the time to analyse certain products, and you're about to make a decision whether to buy them or not, it's certainly worth some of your time looking at that analysis and deciding for yourself. Instead of optimizers then, another way to manage roof orientations like this is to use microinverters. With microinverters, the DC is converted to AC at the panel, and there is no need for a string inverter. And just like optimizers, microinverters, through their individual maximum power point tracking, will seek to ensure the highest possible power output from the array. One other benefit of microinverters is when it comes to extending solar arrays. And as you can see, it's very easy to extend the wiring out to the panels on the new south-facing array. Let's talk about panel aging. Solar panels are specifically designed to last for decades. And that's just as well, because they're generally not accessible when they're on your roof. Most solar panels have lengthy warranties. Most are 25 years and some are up to 40 years. But even though they last that long, they're still subject to degradation. And we can see what that looks like on this chart. At the start of the 25-year period, the panel is operating at 100% of its performance. As time progresses, that performance can be expected to slowly deteriorate. And at the end of 25 years, the performance of the panel will have dropped by about 15%. You can check for the actual expected deterioration rate over 25 years in the datasheet for your panels. Here's the thing though, that rate is not set in stone, and each of your panels will likely degrade at a different rate. In our example here, after a few years, all the panels will have degraded by roughly 5%, but you can see that one of the panels has degraded by 10%. If there are no optimizers or microinverters in your system, then your string inverter will adjust the current flowing through the array according to your most degraded panel. So here we're essentially losing an extra 5% of our production capacity. Now with optimizers or microinverters, because they operate on each panel independently, they will endeavour to get the most power out of each panel, regardless of the condition of the panels around them. It is inevitable that over time your solar panels will become dirty, and if dirt builds up more rapidly on one section of your array, let's say because of a nearby tree or birds roosting on the ridgeline, and you don't have any optimizers or microinverters, this can then bring down the production to the dirtiest panel in your array. You may want to take steps to have your panels cleaned every now and again to avoid such problems, and of course the reduced power generation. In the unlikely event that you have a faulty panel, you will have to replace it. And if it's been some time since the installation of your panels, it may be that your panel make and model is no longer available. Your only recourse might be to replace the faulty panel with a near equivalent one. This isn't too much of an issue if you have optimizers or microinverters in place, but it could be a real headache otherwise. The thing about optimizers is that they consume power all the time, even if they're not increasing the generation for large parts of the day. I've heard reports that optimizers consume around 1 to 2% of the total power your panels can generate. Assuming our solar array produces 6,000 kilowatt hours every year, over 25 years that's a whopping 150,000 kilowatt hours. Let's assume the optimizers on the array consume 2% of that power. This works out to be 3,000 kilowatt hours over the 25 years. And just to put this in real terms, in the UK, the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity is currently 34 pence. So that's a running cost of more than £1,000 over 25 years at today's prices. But you don't actually need to work out the cost. All you need to do is work out how many extra kilowatt hours you will achieve with optimizers, and that will depend on the amount of shading you get. For example, if you only get shading for part of the day and only on some of your panels, you might find that the gain you'll get with optimizers is only 2 or 3% anyway, remembering that your panels are already pretty good at managing shading by themselves. And we all know that the more complex something is, the more chance it will fail. So the question then becomes, will the extra few percentage points of generation offset the costs and the hassle of optimizer failures? Let's talk about failure rates then. Remember I mentioned Mark Kavanagh from MC Electrical earlier? Well, after many hundreds of optimizer and microinverter installations, he has amassed a powerful set of statistics on the failure rates of both. Here is a blog post Mark published in 2018 but updated in 2020. I have to say, it doesn't look good for solar edge optimizers. The failure rate after nearly 3,300 unit installations over 5 years was over 2%. But remember, these units are typically warranted for 25 years to match the panel warranties. So if we extrapolate, this works out to be a 10% chance of an Optimiser failing during the warranty period. And if you have an array of, say, 10 panels, all with Optimisers, then you should expect one of those Optimisers to fail at some point. And as the warranties generally don't include the costs of getting to the failed unit, you'll have to pay for those scaffolding costs yourself. Looking at the failure rates for microinverters, particularly N-phase, the picture is looking much better. With over 3,100 N-phase microinverters installed over 5 years, only 3 units have failed. This gives a failure rate of just 0.096%. Again, we can multiply that by 5 to get a rate over 25 years, and then by 10, assuming a 10-panel array, to get an expected failure rate of 0.48%. This essentially means there's only a 1 in 200 chance you'll experience a microinverter failure in a typical installation. Not too bad. Mark has provided a comprehensive report on N-phase microinverters here, and like everything he puts out, it's well worth a read. There's no doubt about it, knowing exactly what's going on up there with your solar array is a great benefit, and with Optimisers or microinverters, you get this capability as part of the package. And for many people, that alone is worth the cost and the risk. Here are some monitoring capabilities available on the market today. Watch though, because some manufacturers may restrict the level of monitoring that you receive as a customer. The manufacturers see everything that is going on, but may only provide a subset of that information to the installer, and even less information to you, the customer. And even if the manufacturer provides system alerts to the installer, let's say for a panel that is exhibiting a fault, how likely is it, do you think, that the installer will pass on those alerts to you? You'll want that alert looking into straight away, but the installer might be a little reluctant. So as with any kind of service you're looking to purchase, it's well worth spending some time researching how those who already have the service are getting on with it. In the UK, there's a highly active solar group on Facebook. It has over 20,000 members to date, and it's growing rapidly. It's a great forum for getting quick answers to questions on all sorts of solar topics, and I highly recommend it. I've put a link into the description, or you can simply scan this QR code on your smartphone and join in the conversation. And even if you choose not to go for Optimisers or microinverters, there are still ways you can check for panel issues, for example using a thermal imaging tool like this. These imaging tools are getting cheaper all the time, and some even make use of your own smartphone features, reducing the cost even further. Thermal imaging can help identify hotspots or bypass diode failures, as you can see from these images. Make sure though that you use a unit that is specifically designed for looking at solar panels, as not all of them are. Okay, so what's my own view on Optimisers and microinverters with regard to shading? I didn't give my own view in the last video, but after all the research I've carried out, here's where I stand. Whatever goes on your roof has to withstand all manner of weather conditions and temperature variances, and having a problem on your roof post-installation is a real headache. So limiting the complexity of the technology up there reduces the potential of having any problems, and solar panels already do a very good job of managing partial shading conditions. And in my view, Optimisers and microinverters have yet to make a strong case that they improve matters. Also, the reliability of Optimisers to date is not as high as I'd like it. The reliability of certain microinverters like N-phase is much better, so make them a candidate. But only if I wanted monitoring. Now don't get me wrong, monitoring is certainly a bonus, but the best it can do is tell me I've got a problem. It can't actually prevent that problem or even fix it for me. So I'm actually of the mind that simplicity equals longevity. And although I don't have any shading issues with my own roof, even if I did, I'd rather take the hit in generation loss than increase the risk to having to fix problems on my roof in the future. So for me, a string inverter without any Optimisers suits me fine. I hope everything you've heard today helps you in your decision making, or at least gives you further food for thought. There's a podcast available called Energy Reality, which looks at energy transition and its challenges. This podcast is run by Duncan Massey, and he was kind enough to invite me on last week to talk about all things solar. including my views on the future of energy and also my own solar installation plans. Here's a link to the video in case you're interested. Now, you may not be aware, but I'm a huge fan of Octopus Energy here in the UK. They're doing an incredible amount to move energy generation away from fossil fuels and onto renewables. You can support Octopus in that work by switching your energy over to them. And if you give them my referral code when you phone them, we'll each get £50 credited to our accounts. That money goes a long way to supporting my work on this channel. So a huge thank you to those who already signed up using my referral code. I really appreciate it. Until next time then, thanks for watching.